Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon. The weather is cooperating, and I promise you that I talked to James Spann personally, and he said it was warming up, so you don't have to leave in the cold. It'll be warm and get close to 60 degrees. So this is Alabama. If you stand still long enough, you'll stand in a snowstorm and get sunburned and drowned. But but it's certainly welcome you all here on behalf of the First Bank of Alabama. First Bank of Alabama has been so gracious to us to help with the brown bag series, and I know that there are people were here last week, and we've got one of them. Chris, is anyone else here other than you? Okay, do you have money? If anyone needs a quick loan, do you handle that? Okay. You know, in the modern day world, you would just take it in your hip pocket and go ahead and arrange it. You wouldn't have to go by your office. But again, we thank all of you for coming out. This series has just really been wonderful. And today we have James Hansen, who holds a PhD from Ohio State University. He is the author of a dozen books or so on aerial space history and the history of science and technology. And he taught at Auburn University and was served as department chair of the Honors College, and still has a relationship there. His book, The First Man of Neil Armstrong, was on the biography of Neil Armstrong, was the first man on the moon. And he had a bestseller book that had major book awards and was translated into 25 foreign languages. So we're going to hear not from somebody who's trying to put something together. We deal with people today that's got it all together. But his first man book with Armstrong became a film of the same name, Universal Studios, and won an Academy Award. He is an avid golfer, and that reminded me of something somebody told me. A man asked me last week. He said, that man is coming. He once a good friend of Clint Eastwood as he played golf with him. I said, absolutely. They're just the best of friends, and he plays golf with him. So I'm not going to call his name, but he'll be here. So turn off your cell phones. Oh, let me forget. Peggy, where did she go? Peggy. Oh, I see you now. She goes along with Dr. Hansen to make sure that she knows everything that he does and says, and she can repeat it back to him with mistakes, with the commas, the periods, the exclamation marks, and the question marks. So, Peggy, we're thrilled to have you with us. So, with no further ado, turn off your cell phones. And Dr. Hansen has an interesting storyline that we think, I really think is the story of two crazy men, but he can put more life to that than I can. Dr. Hansen.
Well, thank you very much, Ted, and thank you for such a nice audience. Happy Valentine's to all of you. I hope you're getting your fill of cards and chocolate and kisses. And I'm not talking about chocolate kisses, Hershey kisses either. So my wife, all dressed in red, is my Valentine. We've been married 47 and a half years. So she also sits in the back, and at appropriate points, she'll give me this, which means time to stop, Jim. Yeah, this is an unusual book for me, Completely Mad. It wasn't one that I intended necessarily to write. These are my aerospace books. These are the books I write about aviation and space, and so that's really what I've hung my hat on through most of my career. Lots of Neil Armstrong stuff, lots of things about space, but also about airplanes. So I also wrote this book that Ted referred to. I wrote A Difficult Par, which was a biography of Robert Trent Jones Sr., the guy that we see his name on the road signs all the time. So that's the one book kind of out of my area that I've written. But I've been a golfer longer than I've been a historian, so it was something that I really wanted to do. So this is the book. Tom McClean, John Fairfax, and the epic race to row solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, what I tell in this story is, in this book, is the story of two men who in the year 1969 vied to be the first ever to row solo across the Atlantic Ocean. The inspiration for the book, actually, there were three things, and it connects back to my space history. You're looking at the Apollo 11 crew over here, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, who I had done a lot of writing about. When I was researching in the papers for writing First Man, in the Armstrong papers, I found a copy of the telegram that you see here to the right of the screen, and I'll just read it to you here quickly. This is how I knew that this had ever happened, and I saw this first probably in 2002 or something when I was working on the Armstrong book. And these guys were in quarantine when they came back from the lunar landing because there was fear that they would bring back bacteria, the Andromeda strain, as it was called in a novel. So they had to be in quarantine for nearly 3 weeks. They're in just a mobile quarantine unit here. They'll be in a larger apartment when they get back to Houston. But when they're there, they're doing kind of what I think they were doing when they came across this idea that they needed to write to John Fairfax. They were reading newspapers and magazines and watching some TV and stuff. And they saw in the Miami Herald an article about a man, John Fairfax, a British guy, who had just landed his rowboat on Hollywood Beach in Florida, just near Fort Lauderdale. And he was the first ever to row solo across the Atlantic. So they wrote him this very interesting telegram to John Fairfax from the Apollo 11 astronauts. May we of Apollo 11 add our sincere congratulations to the many you have undoubtedly already received for your bold and courageous feat of rowing alone across the Atlantic. We who sail what President Kennedy once called the new ocean of space are pleased to pay our respects to the man who single-handedly has conquered the still formidable ocean of water. We find it an interesting coincidence that you completed your arduous voyage here on Earth at a spot very near the one from which we started our voyage to the moon, and that you arrived at your destination quite near the time that we reached ours. He had arrived on July 19th, and the moon landing was July 20th. That was the day before the first moon landing. Yours, however, was the accomplishment of one resourceful individual, while ours depended upon the help of thousands of dedicated workers in the United States and all over the world. As fellow explorers, we salute you on this great occasion. And there's Fairfax. As he's arriving, he's lifting his oars into a victory sign, arriving at Hollywood Beach on July 19th, a day before the moon landing. And I had filed that telegram away far back into my memory, and I wasn't planning to do anything with it. I just thought, this was kind of interesting. I never knew that this had even been done. It was certainly nothing that got it was kind of not a good time for Fairfax to do this because the moon landing is getting all the publicity, and anything about ignoring the Atlantic is going to be, back in the very little bit of story in the back of the paper. So I started to think about this telegram, and I still had a copy of it in my files during COVID. And this is the second thing that leads to me writing this book. I had a couple of cartoons that I found that kind of represent, I had to find something to do. My wife and I, like probably your families, are stuck in the house. What are you going to do? And so what I did, I didn't immediately start thinking about the Fairfax telegram. I started thinking, I need to read some books that get me out of the house. Take me on adventures. I'm not an adventurous person by nature, but I love to live vicariously through other people and through their adventures. So I ordered some books. Right, Peggy? Some of these are probably shoes and pocketbooks and stuff that she ordered, but some of them are books. You can see the Amazon boxes. This isn't really our house. We never had quite that many. But there are some of the books I, in fact, did order. The book about Shackleton's expedition to the Antarctic, in the 19-teens, The Lost City of Z, Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, The Gypsy Moth Circling the World, Chichester's book. To the bottom right, Sir Edmund Hillary's assault with this Sherpa on Mount Everest. So I was reading all these books, And I was not thinking about writing anything, but then in the middle of reading all this stuff, then I started thinking back, what about this Fairfax guy? Was there something I could maybe do, or maybe I could write? Well, there's a third thing that happened. There was a song that I played over and over again when I was, Peggy's mother, who was very ill, came and stayed with us, and she was in her early 90s. She came to live with us in Birmingham during COVID. And so oftentimes when they're watching old reruns of Perry Mason or To Tell the Truth, I've got my earbuds in, I'm listening to music or podcasts or something. There's a song called Ocean Cloud. It was like this epic 18-minute song. And I had a connection to it. When the First Man movie was being made, Rick Armstrong, who's the oldest son of Neil and Janet Armstrong, Rick is a musician, as you can see here. He plays guitar. And we were on the set together of the making of the movie, and we were talking about all kinds of things. And he was telling me about the group Marillion, a British progressive rock group that dates back into the 70s. And I kind of heard of them, and I kind of knew a little bit about their music. But he told me that this Ocean Cloud song was something I should listen to. It told the story of a man named Don Allen, who died in 1992 at age 55, but he had crossed the Atlantic later. He'd crossed the Atlantic in the 80s. And he ended up ruining his health because he actually crossed from east to west and then was coming back from west to east as well. And he eventually made it, but he was like 85 pounds or something, and he just was in terrible shape afterwards. He died in 92, and the song Ocean Cloud is all about his row, crossing the Atlantic and back. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, let's write a book about Don Allen. I love his song. I played it to death. I highly recommend you listen to it. But as it turned out, so I investigated. I actually called the lead singer of Marillion and got a hold of him through Rick Armstrong and said, I'd like to maybe do something with Don Allen, and found out that he had a brother named Jeff, and Jeff had research materials. Well, long story short, it just didn't work out. Doing something on Don Allen didn't work out, although I do dedicate the book to his memory. But there was Fairfax, and I was thinking, well, let's just write about Fairfax. Well, it turned out that Fairfax had died in the year 2012. He had died in Las Vegas. He had become a professional gambler later in life. And it was something of a local legend in Las Vegas on the Strip. When he died in 2012, the Las Vegas newspapers had fairly large obituary columns written about him because they knew about his ocean row, and they also knew that he was really a well-known gambler on the Strip. So I thought, well, maybe I could do something with him. And here you see a routing of his. I'm going to make reference to this map a couple of times. You can see how he took off from the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa, crossed not really the South Atlantic, but southern parts of the northern hemisphere, crossed over and came up through the Caribbean to Hollywood Beach. And it took him 180 days. It was over 39, almost 4,000 miles on the sea. 180 days on the sea. He had not planned on being there that long. You can see his boat, the 22-foot craft that he called Britannia. You're going to hear a lot more about him in a second. And there's another ash. This is the routing I have for him that's in my book, and I have it laid out where I wanted the readers to be able to see where certain things were happening during not just the latitude and longitude of where he was at, but some of the notable things that happened when he encountered other ships or when he had special problems with storms. So I wanted that mapped out on Fairfax's route. Well, as it turned out, and this was the crucial new information I got, he was not the only one on the ocean trying to be first in 1969. There was another British man from the British Army, a British paratrooper named Tom McClean, who wanted to be first himself. And you're going to hear a lot more about him. He left from St. John's, Newfoundland in May of 1969, and he arrived 7 days after the moon landing, so 8 days after Fairfax landed. He landed at Black Sod Bay on the northwest coast of Ireland. And I started to think, well, what did they know about each other? Was it a race? At least maybe unofficially a race, but did they know about each other, and were they trying to beat each other? And so I thought, well, maybe there's a way. Is McClean living? Fairfax is dead, but is McClean living? Well, he is. He was living. He's still alive today. He lives. He created kind of an adventure center in the highlands on the coastal highlands of Scotland, where if you really want a raw, primitive human experience of hiking and boating and hunting and all kinds of things, and you live in a very Spartan kind of dormitory, you can go to Tom's place. Well, it's still COVID. So I get a hold of him and tell him what I'm interested in doing, telling this combined story of McClean and Fairfax. And Tom says, yeah, that sounds like that could be interesting. So I started Skyping with him. I Skyped with him innumerable times, long interviews with him. He sent me his logbooks. And in the meantime, I was getting information that I could. There's something called the Ocean Rowing Society that's based outside of London. And it keeps all the records and stuff of all these ocean rows, failed and successful. And so from them, I was able to get a lot of Fairfax material. So I had enough material to get started on what ended up being completely mad. Here's Fairfax before he died. It shows him in Las Vegas. I think he's in the stratosphere in the top left. Isn't that what that's called, the stratosphere? And I showed a baccarat table because that's the game he played. That's the same game that James Bond always plays in his movies, where you're trying to get 9, I think, is what you try to do with baccarat. And there he is, I think, at Caesar's Palace in front. So here's what he became, this legendary gambler in Las Vegas. And here's Tom. This is Tom today. Tom's 82 now, I think. And so he's the one that I got to know really, really well. Of course, he had some Fairfax information for me, too. But not that he really was that interested in telling me Fairfax stories. He wanted his story told. So anyway, that's where I start off to try to put these stories together. And it's a heck of an adventure story. If I was just telling an adventure story, it would be good in its own right. I mean, 2 men who fathomed the unfathomable, who it was not exactly a race, but both men desperately wanted to be first. And just to clue you in, McClean knew all about Fairfax. Fairfax knew nothing about McClean. So that's an aspect of what is or isn't a race. So what I wanted to do in the book is have you as a reader go with them on their competing journeys, tasting the salt, fearing the sharks, and there were sharks to fear, fighting the sea, overcoming being capsized, which happens to both of them what I have are paintings, they're not photographs, but those are some of the conditions at sea that you would face in a rowboat. Waves, according to Tom, waves as high as 50 feet where he faced in the North Atlantic. Battle with the elements, battle with their own personal limitations, battle with their own psychologies. It's a heck of a story. What sort of person does this? That became the crucial question for me. And again, because I'm such a chicken and I don't want to do anything like this, I kept thinking with relation to the Apollo 11 telegram, I would go to the moon in an instant before I'd get in a rowboat and try to row across the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, you got mission control, your spacecrafts, and this is, remember, 69. There's no GPS. They don't know where they're at. There's no cell phones. I mean, there are satellite phones that they could have had but didn't really use. They have sextants. They can get readings when the weather's not, when they could get a good reading. They don't know where they're at half the time. So what sort of person does this? Could I write a psychological study? Yeah, I'm not qualified. Our son, Nathaniel, is a psychiatrist in Vestavia Hills. Well, so I could ask him some questions. Not that he specializes in that sort of crazy people. But I can't I'm not qualified for a psychological study, but I can still try to understand motivation. I mean, I think, and I did read some literature that dealt with people that do crazy things. I mean, race car drivers, mountain climbers, bullfighters, well, they somewhat crazy. I wouldn't do any of those 3 things myself, although I would like to go to Talladega and get in my car and take it around a couple of laps without any other cars there. But then there's these other guys. There's free climbers. There's skiing on volcanoes. You ever hear of volcano skiing? There's high wire, what do they call them? Highliners. You know, this guy walking across this deep gap. There's paraskiers. You know, there's all kinds of these people. Who does this? You know, that's not me. But I was interested in how do the psychologists talk about these people as to what's motivating them. So I'm not qualified to do a psychological study, but I do write biography. And I think, you know, like Wordsworth said in the poem centuries ago, the child is the father to the man. And if the man is going to decide to do crazy things, let's look at him as a kid. Let's see what he was at a kid. How was he parented? Who were his friends? What was his background? So how do you do a biography in the context of telling the story of two rows crossing each other on the ocean? Well, you find moments in the adventure story where you can sort of pause with the reader and flash back to an earlier time. You probably see this in all kinds of movies all the time. You know, it's a tough little technique to use, but it can be used if you're careful about how you do it. So that's what I did. I wanted to integrate their biographies. And they were young men. They lived a lot longer lives than Fairfax was in his late 20s, I think, when he crossed, and McClean, he was in his early 30s, and McClean was in his late 20s. So they were still young men. Their biographies were pretty much just their childhood and adolescence. So Fairfax first. I need to tell you some things about Fairfax, and I don't expect you to read all that, but I will tell you the essence of it. He's born in 1937 in Italy, in Rome, to an English father who worked for the BBC. And his mother was a Bulgarian whose family had emigrated from Bulgaria in the mid-30s. They really have sort of fascist connections. Bulgaria's history is not something we study very much, so I had to study some of it. They immigrate to Mussolini's Rome, to fascist Rome, right before World War II. And then when war broke out in 1939, the father, Kenneth Fairfax, goes back to London for the war and never accepts the boy as his own and never sees the boy until much, much later. I'll tell you when. The mother had contacts in Mussolini's government and at the Vatican. She had a brother who was also there in Rome with her, who was a doctor, who apparently treated venereal diseases of VIP people in the government and maybe even in the Vatican. So she was kind of a high-class escort. John, I'm just picking out some of the major things to point out. As a boy, John joined the Italian Boy Scouts, which was kind of like the Hitler Youth, the Italian version of the Hitler Youth. So he became an Italian Boy Scout. And as a child, he was expelled from the Boy Scouts because he opened fire with a revolver on a hut containing other scouts. He was actually trying to shoot his scout leader. And so he was like 8 years old, something like that. After the war, John Fairfax moved with his mother and his uncle to Argentina. A lot of fascists go to, there's boys that go to Brazil, and then there's a lot of fascists that end up in Buenos Aires in Argentina. He goes with his mother. They live in Buenos Aires. Age 13, he leaves home to go, and he goes and lives in the jungle, as he said, like Tarzan. Stayed there for several months, surviving by hunting and bartering skins with local tribes. And as a teenager, he does also read about a famous row that had been done in 1896 by Norwegian Americans Frank Samuelson and George Harbaugh, which was the first ever crossing by rowboat of the Atlantic. And he knew, he tells this in his memoirs, that he knew at that moment when he read about this that he was going to do that himself. He was going to be the first to row solo across. And here's just a quick glimpse of Samuelson and Harbaugh, 1896, set out from the Battery in New York City in June. 55 days later, they land off the coast of the Cornish Peninsula of Great Britain. So that's what had happened before. Two men had been able to do it. No one had been able to do it, had done it until into the mid-60s. At age 20, John considers suicide. At least he tells us that, by confronting a jaguar. He's going to take on a jaguar. He changes his mind, good thinking, and he shot the animal instead and sold its skin. Age 22, he flies to New York City. Then he drives across America by himself to San Francisco, where he lives for 2 months with a Chinese prostitute. When he runs out of money, she kicks him out, and he decides he's going to go back home to Argentina. He's going to go by bicycle. Can you imagine riding a bicycle from San Francisco to Buenos Aires? Well, he gets as far as Guatemala, and then he hitchhikes on to Panama, where he falls in with pirates and ends up spending 3 years smuggling guns, whiskey, and cigarettes. And he makes a dramatic escape, which he narrates in detail. He makes a dramatic escape from the pirates and from the local authorities, and he returns to Argentina, not by bicycle, but by horseback, which is a fairly long ride if you look at the continent of South America. Johnny Fairfax. Back in Argentina, he starts a mink farm. Yeah. And he also reads about a successful road that had taken place in 1966 across the Atlantic by 2 British Army officers, Che Blythe and John Ridgway, and realized, of course, he'd sort of had this idea, he tells us anyway, that he was going to row the boat across, and he thought that even when he was a young teenager. Now he realized that if he's going to fulfill his destiny as a first person to row solo across the Atlantic, that he's going to have to do it pretty soon. Somebody else could beat him to it. So there's a picture of Ridgway and Blythe leaving Cape Cod in June of 1966. Quite a story on their own. 92 days at sea. 3,000 miles later, they reached the Aran Islands off the Irish coast in gale force conditions. So they were very lucky to make it. I had to throw this in kind of as a footnote because they were kind of in a race too. There were 2 British journalists, David Johnstone and John Hoare, who were trying to actually be the first since Samuelson and Harbaugh to cross. They left, whereas Ridgway and Blythe left from Cape Cod, they left from Virginia Beach. They survive 106 days at sea, including 14 gales of various strengths and 1 hurricane. And their row ends in September 1966 when they both lost their lives in a second hurricane. And we know they lost their lives because their boat, Puffin, was picked up by a Canadian warship on October 4th, 1966, and returned to England. And one of the artifacts found in Puffin, in the boat, was Johnstone's journal, which gave a complete account of the men's time at sea. So this was a very dangerous thing to be doing, even with 2 people, or probably with 8 people. But the idea of doing it by yourself, that was really almost out of the question. Well, Johnny starts to prepare for his row. He travels to England to get financial backing and then to get a proper boat ready for himself and getting all the necessary supplies. This picture down here, you see him in the tie, and he's with the white-haired guy is Uffe Fox, who's England's best boat designer at the time. He actually had connections with the royal family and some of the sailing that some of the royal family did. And he designed a very progressive boat. They call it was I don't want to go into I do in the book, but I don't want to take the time to go into the actual design of the boat other than to say it was self-righting and it was self-bailing. In other words, when water came into the boat and water was going to come in when you're in those sorts of waves, he designed kind of sluiceways where the water would, as was coming in, would then be drained back out. Very ingenious design, which he benefited from. How did he find that? Well, let me do this. This is what I wanted to mention. He meets his father for the first time when he goes to London, and here's what happened. I want to just read it very briefly. John never saw his father again after Kenneth returned to England in 1939, when John was only 2.5 years old. Mara, who was his mother, told her son that his father had been killed in action with the RAF, and thus John grew up thinking his dad was a war hero. Kenneth did not return to Rome after the war, even to dissolve the marriage. Apparently, he managed that elsewhere. Not until many years later, on the eve of John's crossing in 1969, did Mara tell her son the truth. She began by saying she had, quote, something very serious to tell him. She then revealed that Kenneth Fairfax had not been killed in the war, but was still alive and serving in London as the director of the BBC Overseas Service. Apparently, Mara believed that John would be mixing with journalists and the press before and after his ocean voyage, and she didn't want him finding out that way. Upon hearing this revelation, John felt an urgency to meet his dad. He arranged to meet him for a drink at his father's gentleman's club on St. James Street in London. The meeting did not go well. John was desperately in need of money for his Atlantic expedition, but it was not for that purpose that he wanted to see his father. But that's what the father thought John was after, and sternly told him that it was no good of him to be coming begging for money after all the years separating them. Kenneth had remarried years ago, had a new family with children, and as far as he knew, John might not even be his son, possibly because he was aware that Mara had at least one abortion before John's birth. Johnny was devastated. The meeting, quote, absolutely gutted him. There was no further contact of any sort between father and son. Kenneth died in the 1970s. Well, again, I'm letting some of the biography just speak for itself. Maybe you can come to some of your own conclusions or preliminary conclusions about what could motivate this type of person to do this kind of thing. Okay. Yeah. So how did Johnny cover his expenses? Well, he was a gambler before he was a professional gambler. So he goes to the London casinos in late 68, early 69, and plays roulette, plays baccarat, and apparently wins a pretty good little stash of money. Also, he meets a young woman, Sylvia Cook, British girl who came from some money, and I'm not going to say swindled her, but because they end up having a fairly lengthy relationship, but she becomes his girlfriend, and she gives him a bunch of money that really she thinks is a loan, but she doesn't get all of it back. So she helps finance it. And then he gets a deal with Horlicks. Have any of you heard of Horlicks? It's a British food manufacturer of powdered and hydrated foods. I guess its main product over the years was its malted milk, like chocolate malted milk. And Horlicks provided all of the food, all the prepackaged foods for Johnny to take on the trip, which ended up, and this is a significant piece of information, all of that food together on his rowboat weighed about 250 pounds. It was a fairly lengthy, fairly weighty cargo. He decides on taking the southern route, as you've already seen, because he wants to get going. And you're not going to get going in the North Atlantic in January, unless you're really an idiot, But if he leaves from the Canary Islands and goes the southern route, you can leave in January. Figures you can leave in January. And that also means he thinks he can get to Florida before the hurricane season starts, which, is hopeful, not necessarily an absolute fact. So there you can see how he's going to take this alternative route. But the alternative route doesn't turn out quite the way, if you understand the trade winds. The trade winds actually, and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English and the Dutch learned this, and this is how they are able to conquer the Atlantic the way they did back in the 1500s and 1600s, is that the trades blow from east to west in the southern and middle part of the Atlantic, and then the trades come back around, and I try to explain the science of this in the book. Then the trades come around on the other side and help push from west to east, the other direction. Well, he figures if he takes off from the Canary Islands and he gets the trades that you normally would assume to get, that he could move quickly across and make it well before hurricane season. Well, take a look up at the top from where he leaves and look at the kind of curlicues that he's making. He's on the water for nearly 2 weeks, and the first land he sees is Villa Cisneros on the coast of Africa. He's going backwards. He's getting nowhere. The winds are not helping him. The currents are not helping him. And it's not helping him that he's got 250 damn pounds of Horlicks dehydrated food packaged up for him. So what does he do? He decides he's going to dump all the food overboard. He dumps it all overboard to make it easier to make progress. And I wish I had a picture of him. Of course, the pictures we're seeing of him were taken by somebody else, So he figures, well, I'll just catch fish. I'll find ways to eat. So this is what he does. Now, of course, this wasn't taken by somebody else on his boat. Before he got going, he practiced some spear fishing, and he was good at posing for photographers. He was going for big publicity. One other thing I should have added to the previous slide, he had a major, I think it was called ITN. He had a major British media conglomerate backing his trip as well, to which he had to promise to make exclusive interviews to them. In fact, some interviews would be done on the sea as he was approaching his successful landing. These are two pictures that he took. He lassoed a shark inside the same shark that he beheaded, where he had this mess of baby sharks, that he found in the belly, and of course he had a way to cook them up. He ate some of them raw. He ate some of them with his cooker. But it didn't work out quite as well as he thought. I mean, he didn't eat as, it was a lot harder to do all of this fishing and net rowing that he thought he needed to do. But he didn't want that, he hated the Horlicks food anyway. He said it tasted terrible. And here's another thing about him. This is a picture he took when he was coming across the Atlantic, and a Norwegian cargo ship comes nearby. And I'm going to tell you how McClean handled that in a bit, if my time doesn't run out. But what did Fairfax do whenever a ship went by? Well, first he would avoid it if possible. It was a danger in night, you could get run over by these things. But he would hail the ship, and he would ask to come aboard, where he'd have a meal, he'd take a shower, have a cocktail, get back in his boat better provisioned. That's how he got some more food. I've put in these rectangles. Look at what, you've seen this already, but look at this. Point D, went aboard passing tanker Bulford for a shower. Went aboard passing ship Russian ship Tolstoy. There he had lots of vodka. Breakfast aboard the German ship the Rhinoor. Went aboard the Norwegian ship Bayros. Goes ashore actually on Camp Verde. Goes aboard a Costa Grande yacht. This is when ITN interviews him. So he had some help, right? It wasn't like he's going straight across without stopping, without help. It's an assisted row, but he does get there first. He gets there before Fairfax by 8 days. But we'll see, I'll already give this away, Fairfax doesn't believe in getting help. He wants to do it completely unassisted. He gets out of the boat because he has some problems. He capsizes and gets out of the boat. But he doesn't get out of the boat. If a ship goes by him, he'll take a navigational read from them, which he does because he doesn't know where he's at half the time. So he'll have them give him a fix where he is, but he never gets out, never gets any of that help. But in the record books, Fairfax, since he made it first, is the one that gets the record for being first across, and McClean is almost forgotten, and even though his was completely unassisted. Here's a picture of him when he got off on the yacht, when ITN interviewed him. Actually, if you go on YouTube, you can find the complete interview of John Fairfax that ITN did on that yacht. Recorded a lengthy review. He had dinner and drinks, spent a night in bed there. He was still some 100 miles from the Florida coast. There he is landing at Hollywood Beach. And people were waiting for him. It wasn't a huge crowd, but there were lots of people waiting for him. And he took advantage of the publicity and did for most of the rest of his life, actually. And back in 2019, there was a 50th anniversary of his landing. There was actually a marker that was placed there. Now, if you go to Hollywood Beach, indicating being the first to cross. Now, I've got to be a little bit quicker with McClean, but you have to see the comparison. His story is a very different one. Not that there aren't some similarities, but a different one. He was born, like Fairfax, he was a bastard child. He was born out of wedlock in Dublin, born in February 1942. He didn't discover the names of his parents until many years later. He was abandoned as a baby. He started life as an orphan at Bethany Home in Dublin. At age 5, he was sent essentially from foster parents to a place called Fagans, which is a Protestant orphanage outside of London. And his story is really kind of the classic story of an orphan boy, kind of if you've ever read or seen Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. And in this particular case, there are some other similarities with Oliver Twist. Tom was small, he was quiet, he was a little backward, he was bullied. He has very bitter memories of the place. Not some people were nice to him, but a lot of people were not nice to him. At age 15, Fagans turned him out and sent him out into the world. Time to leave the orphanage after being there for 10 years. First, he went to a village where he became an apprentice carpenter. Then he moved into the countryside to work on a farm. It was a much better experience than in the orphanage, but still it was not easy on him. As soon as he got to be 17 and a half years old, which was the minimum age for joining the elite infantry unit of the British Army, the paratrooper unit, Tom enlisted. He wanted to be a paratrooper. He took to the Army like a duck to water. In some ways, being in the Army, even though it was rigidly disciplined, it was a heck of a lot easier than being at Fagan's orphanage. So he didn't mind the discipline. He did hard work. He was very physical. He was very tough-minded. He became this paratrooper in the parachute regiment of the British Army. He saw action in Bahrain and Aden on the Arabian Peninsula. You know, the stuff's going on in the Middle East has been going on for decades, not for centuries. The British were doing what we were doing now, trying to keep a lid on things. In one NATO exercise in Greece in 1961, Tom is accidentally shot. The bullet hits him in the lower part of the stomach. It went through his bladder and pelvis, missing the bone. It blew off the left cheek of his buttocks, hit another bloke in the leg, and buried itself in the ground. Without quick medical attention, he wouldn't have lasted 15 minutes. He was flown to a hospital in Malta. It was on the critical list for a week, stayed in the hospital for a month, not back to active duty for 4 months. At that point, he progresses into Special Air Service, the SAS. Here you can see him in the back right, part of his SAS platoon. It's kind of like the Navy SEALs, is what the SAS was like. He sees action on the border of Malaysia and Indonesia. Communist insurgents and British Empire has got to continue to try to keep a lid on things. Tom was great at jungle fighting. He was very stealthy, and you had to be very stealthy in the jungle to not to make noise and to just do things right. He was very good at it. He also saw combat action in Guyana in South America. He was still with the SAS in 1969 when he got the idea to row. He knew Ridgway and Blythe just as Fairfax did. He knew them better, in fact, because they were paratroopers like Tom was, and he actually went to talk to Ridgway and Blythe about their row and how they did it. And Tom came to the conclusion, well, if 2 men can do it, why can't one? And the SAS motto was, who dares, wins. And Tom was very much part of that. I was going to read this to you, but I'll let you read it if you get your own book. He has a conversation with his commanding officer. So he's got to go in and say, I'm going to go do this thing, and I'm still active duty. Can I have permission to do this? And he said, well, what are you going to do? I'm going to row the Atlantic by myself. The commanding officer tells him, well, what kind of experience do you have at rowing on the ocean? None. I just think I can do it. I've talked to Ridgway and Blythe, and I think I can do it. And the commanding officer, what does he say? You're completely mad, son. But as it turned out, they actually gave him some help. They helped build his boat at the SAS base. They helped him get the boat built. They helped him fly over to Newfoundland to get him started. So they didn't say no. They knew that their paratroopers were kind of crazy people anyway. And there's Tom with his boat. It was called the Super Silver. He actually, Gillette Silver Blades was part of the sponsorship of his boat. He always referred to it as silver. He sort of left the super off. It was based on the type of boat was called a dory. It's kind of a boat design that was fairly standard. It was used by a lot of people in Newfoundland fishing off the Grand Banks, and there were lots of dories built in England and the UK generally. There's St. John's, where he starts his flight. He's actually going to go to St. John's this year and sort of not recreate the trip, but he's going to go there this year and connect back with some of the people that, if they're still around, that he met inside 1969. This always got to me. He said one day he counted how many oar strokes he made in a day, and he stopped counting at 24,000. Can you imagine? Because you're rowing and you're going this way, right? I mean, you're not rowing that. You're rowing backwards, and you're coming on a wave and you're going back down and water splashing. He doesn't have self-bailing design boat. He's got a can. So he's bailing water out all the time. 24 oar strokes a day, and you can imagine what happens to his hands. Even though he leaves in May, the North Atlantic in May can still be kind of nasty. So he has frostbite. He has to do what he can to protect himself from the elements. He has a hard time with his hands and his feet. See some icebergs. Got to avoid those. This again is a painting, but I showed it to Tom once, and I said, "Does this sort of?" He said, "It's not big enough. The waves aren't big enough, Jim." And this is a satellite picture that I show of the North Atlantic, not because this shows anything about his. It shows what he doesn't see. I mean, if you were crossing the Atlantic today, and there's still people doing this, not by themselves for the most part, you know, they're going to get pictures and they're going to know what kind of weather systems are facing them. They don't have any idea in 1969 what's going on, or have little idea. Because they're not, I mean, if they could have connected back to the RAF and what kind of, you get weather reports that the pilots are sending back, then he could know something. But he's not communicating like that. And here's how he lived through it was just like a little piece of canvas over the top of his and he had a little cooker just like Fairfax did. And as I said, when he saw a ship, like this is one of the pictures he took, he just hailed them, and they sometimes would say, "Can we do anything for you?" And he'd just say, "Where am I?" And they'd give him his fix, and he'd say, "Thank you," and he'd go on. He didn't get off for showers and cocktails and other things. So this is the issue of the assisted versus unassisted, which I take on in the book. And I also have a map you can see from this little menu at the bottom that he's not stopping. He sees ships, but he's not stopping and getting off. Here's his arrival at Blacksod Bay in Ireland. It's just landing on Blacksod Bay is kind of a challenge to do. And, well, I got to go back. If I can go back. Yeah. When he finally gets out, he takes really good care of his boat. He just, you know, at first he's not a boater. I mean, he's not a naval sort of person. But you get pretty affectionate to the boat that took you across the Atlantic Ocean. So he made sure that the boat got out of the rocks, got out of the surf, got taken well care of. Whereas Fairfax sort of like, sorry, not our boat. He really wasn't too concerned about his boat. But what Tom does is nobody's there. I mean, compared to Fairfax, where there's people waiting to celebrate, there's nobody there. They don't know he's even doing this, really. And so after he's got his boat secure and protected, he sees a little hut, a little cottage up on top of a bluff, and he goes up, and there's a woman, an older woman, standing at her doorway, at her window, and she's like pulling the curtain aside, looking at this guy. And he comes up to her, and she just cracks open the door a lot, and he says, "Good morning, ma'am. I just rode the Atlantic Ocean, and I wondered if you could tell me where the nearest pub is." She closes the door on him. He's crazy. He didn't do that. But he walks to this pub and goes in the pub and tells the bartender what he's done. The bartender doesn't believe him either. And he doesn't have any money, but the bartender finally says, "Here's a Guinness for you." And it took him several hours and several phone calls from the pub to confirm that he was who he says he was and he had done what he had said he had done. And there he would be later when he created his little adventure center up in northwest Scotland, which you can still go to. If you want to have a really Spartan time out in the wilds of northwest Scotland, Tom would be glad to accommodate that. It wasn't the last time he crossed the ocean. Now look at these three crazy ships. From the left is the smallest boat. He wanted to set the record for the smallest boat ever to cross the Atlantic, which he did a few years later. He set the record, then another guy beat him with a shorter boat. So what does Tom do? Tom takes his chainsaw out, hacks off about a foot and a half of his boat, and goes at it across the Atlantic again. And then he has this British tea company, Taifu. He builds this boat to sell, and he takes that across the Atlantic Ocean. I think that's in New York Harbor there. And then he builds a boat later that is in the shape of a whale. And it's not seaworthy enough to make it all across the Atlantic, but he sails it all the way around Great Britain. This is what Fairfax does. You may remember Sylvia Cook, his girlfriend? Somehow he coaxes her into, "Hey, let's go to San Francisco. We'll have a rowboat, and we'll row to Australia." In 1972, they are the first couple, the first people to row a boat completely across the Pacific Ocean. They have a book called Oars Across the Pacific. And one of the great sources, I mean, I've been so lucky in my career to have people to help me, give me information about a book. Fairfax is dead. Sylvia Cook's alive. And Sylvia, I did several phone calls with her, and she answered email questions to me. She had a lot to say about Johnny Fairfax, believe me, a lot to say about Johnny Fairfax. So, as you can see, I'll end it there. Let me see what I have. I might have a closing slide. Oh, there's Tom with his family. Tom tamed down a little bit after Jill got a hold of him. That was probably in the late 70s. And I go back to where I started. I would not have written the book if not for the interest in who they were. If I was just telling the story, and I really, if you've authored a book, don't look at your Amazon reviews. Somebody gave me a 1-star review on Amazon and said, "Why does he tell us all of this about who they were? Just narrate the adventure, the crossing. We don't need all this background material." Well, all I can do is shake my head and say, I wouldn't have written the darn book if it was just about that. I want to know who they were. Who are these guys? Why did they do it? What effect did it have on them? And again, I don't know. We have a few minutes left, I think. I'll just stop there. I mean, if you guys have any insights into why you think either one of them did it, what were their motivations? I think when I've asked Tom quite directly why he did it, his answer was, it's kind of like, because it was there. It's just, and I'm just going to do it. I think both of them had something to prove to the world, something to prove to themselves. What bothers me is that Tom doesn't get to have the record. Fairfax, he ended up, I counted him up, he got off his boat 10 times crossing. He had all this help. Should he have the record, even though, technically he was there, he did it first. Took him 180 days, where it only took Tom 70, but it's a lot farther to go. And it's not that I'm not amazed by what Fairfax did, but, and I don't think what's really weird is the Ocean Rowing Society that keeps the records. 2 things. I'm not sure they knew how many times Fairfax got off his boat, because he didn't go around advertising it, really. So they might just not have known that. Or if they did know it, they apparently didn't care that he was having these sorts of stoppages and assistance. What I want to do is, and we're still working, probably without success, if we can get this to the British royal family, to Queen Camilla or to King Charles, to get Fairfax, to get McClean some kind, I don't know if they could knight him or not, but to give him some sort of recognition from the British government, because he's never really been properly thanked and appreciated, I think. He's coming over to the United States. We're doing a couple of events together in the fall. But we'll have to just, I'll do what, it's kind of hard to get a book to the royal family and make sure that they're going to pay any attention to it. So thank you so much. I'm sorry if I went over a little bit and didn't leave much time. Are there any questions or comments to make? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. They capsized for different reasons. And Tom, when his boat capsized, he was in very cold water for quite a while. The water was quite a bit warmer for Fairfax's. Both of them, Tom's boat capsized because a shark was coming underneath it. The large shark was coming underneath it. And he was trying to avoid riding the back of the shark any longer, and was moving his oars in such a way that the boat flipped. And he didn't have a self-righting boat like Fairfax did. Fairfax actually, after he ended he tried to make money by offering to fight sharks down in the Bahamas. He thought he could do that. So, yes, sir.
Well, as he got off on these boats, ships, weren't they still sailing? Doesn't that negate his claim to have gone across, rowed across?
That's a good question. That's a good question, because his boat was like moored up and tied up next to their ship. I guess I've always assumed from what I read that the boats were anchored at sea for a period of time while they were taking care of him. But if he did move some distance with them, if they were going in the same direction, then they were moving him closer to the coastline. That's a very good question that somehow the author of this book never pondered. That's a good one. Yes, sir.
What happened to the boats after they
They're both at museums in England. I forget the names of them. They're in separate museums. I think Tom's is in Scotland actually, and Fairfax is somewhere, one of the maritime museums in the London area. They do. Excuse me. I was just going to say they do one boat show together, a major boat show in London after they both succeeded, and Fairfax wouldn't have anything to do with Tom. You know, and there's a picture of them, I think I have it in the book, where they're with some notable VIP types, and Tom is on one end of this picture and Fairfax is on the other. And Fairfax only stayed at the boat show for like one day, and Tom stayed and answered questions for the entire length of the boat show. So, I mean, obviously, I tried not to be too obvious with my preference for Tom. But I think if you met Tom, you'd have a preference for him as well. He's just quite a guy. There is a talk I did with him for a library in Philadelphia that's available on YouTube, where I'm interviewing him and having him comment. And so, if you're really interested, you could find that. But he's just a tremendous individual who. Now, do I think either one of them was clinically mad? No. But mad in a cultural kind of sense. I mean, again, how many of us would think about getting in a boat and rowing across the Atlantic Ocean? You got to be a really certain type of person to do that. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We do have books. My wife, Peggy's back there. If you're interested in getting a book, I also have copies of First Man back there. So it was a different book for me to write, but I really enjoyed writing it, and especially it got me through COVID quite nicely.
Dr. Hansen, thank you. You always do such a great job. And I can't think of anything I'd rather do less than row across the Atlantic. That sounds like a nightmare story to me, but a fantastic. I would rather go to the moon. I'd have to have 3 life jackets, and I don't get in the water above my knees. So thank you so much for that. Glutton for punishment, for sure. Miss Peggy, thank you so much for being here today, too. We want to thank again First Bank, Mr. Chris, Miss Jane for being such a great host, Coast Valley Medical Center for the cookies, Dr. Shirley Spears, Comer Library Foundation. Again, thank you, Dr. Hansen, for the time and the research you put into your presentation. It's fantastic. He does have books for sale in the back, so make sure to stop by there. And he's got copies of both books. He does have the First Man book as well back there available. So if you didn't get one the other time, make sure you grab one of those. Next week, we have Dr. Mike Bunn. Dr. Bunn has been with us before. He's a great presenter, and he's going to be talking about his book on Fort Stoddard. So it's going to be a great program. Thank you again for coming out. We'll see you again next week.